And welcome to the LBC Book Club. Every Monday night at this time we talk to one or two leading authors about books that they've just published. Next week we're going to be talking to Alastair Campbell about the second volume of his diaries, which I think are coming out on Thursday, so we're going to get him quite early. And the week after that we'll be talking to Peter Sissons, the former newsreader and former presenter of Question Time. He's publishing his memoirs. But tonight we have two authors with us in the studio. We have Tim Bale. He's author of The Conservative Party from Thatcher to Cameron. Welcome to the programme, Tim.
Thanks a lot.
Now, I should read from your biographical... I mean, obviously, I should let on that I do know Tim. We have met on various speaking panels in the past. Tim is now a lecturer in politics at Sussex University, as well as the convener of the UK Political Studies Association Specialist Group on Conservatives and Conservatism. But he's actually a lot more interesting than that title suggests.
I can only hope so, yeah.
As you will find out over the course of the next hour. Now, and also joining us is Mark Stevenson, who's written a book called An Optimist Tour of the Future. The subtitle, One Curious Man Sets Out to Answer What's Next. What's next, then?
Right. Oh, God, that's a tricky one. Lots of interesting things are obviously going to happen next. The point of the book was not for me to make predictions. There's a famous quote which is making predictions is very fraught, especially about the future. So it was more about the options and the choice we face. I'm very interested about the narrative of the future, how we think about it. And I became very aware that the narrative of the future we teach ourselves or talk to ourselves about at the moment is pretty down. That deal. We're all going to hell in a handcart. Everything's going terribly, terribly wrong. And actually, the book didn't start off with the word optimist in the title. It was actually just called A World Tour of the Future. And I just wanted to write a book that was talking about... We hear a lot about these technologies, and we don't really understand what they mean. Biotechnology, nanotechnology, what's happening with the climate. And a lot of the press about that and its reflection on politics, I think, is charged or sometimes doesn't serve us very well. So I actually just wanted to write a book because I wasn't really getting what I wanted in terms of understanding where these things were leading us, were they good things, were they bad things. But by the time I'd come back off my sort of year-long tour around the laboratories and various other places around the planet, I'd actually was so excited by a number of things I'd heard that I hadn't heard about anywhere else, that I even cheered up my agent. He said, well, this is amazing. And he says, this is optimistic. And
that's a real achievement, to cheer up a literary agent.
Exactly.
God.
So, I mean, he actually suggested putting optimist in the title. So, so I'm not a natural optimist.
Well, I'm not a great fan of literary agents generally, but I think you obviously have a good one, because I think optimism sells and pessimism doesn't. I always think optimistic politicians, Tim, are more likely to succeed than pessimistic ones. If you look back and look back at US presidential elections and define one of the candidates as an optimist and one as a pessimist, and it's virtually always the optimist that wins. Reagan, Carter, Kennedy, Nixon, I mean, I can go on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, of course, David Cameron, you can argue falls into that bracket very much. I mean, one of the things he did, I think, when he took over the leadership was actually to suggest to the party that it had spent too long kind of, painting things black and actually had to take a more optimistic view, let sunshine in. You may remember that. And I think things have obviously got a little bit more difficult for him, though, obviously, because of the economic downturn. How can you be optimistic about that? And convincing people that there is light at the end of this tunnel, I think, is a challenge even for him.
Well, if you'd like to know what the future holds, Mark's going to tell you over the course of the next hour, and he's going to tell you how optimistic you really can be. And Tim's going to tell you about not the whole history of the Conservative Party, but over the last 20 years, how the Conservative Party maybe has recovered, or maybe not, from the fall of Margaret Thatcher. What have been the prevailing themes in Conservative Party history over the last 20 years? If you've got a question for either of them, the number to call is 0845 6060 973. You can text your question to 84850, email Ian, IAIN, at lbc.co.uk, or you can even tweet us at LBC973. Right, Mark, let's start with you, because I think the media narrative at the moment is incredibly pessimistic. We're told that there's going to, over the next 50 years, there's going to be lots more death, drought, famine, world terrorism, climate catastrophe, and Jordan's new book. What exactly have we got to look forward to?
It's a very apposite question, I think. You're right. If you look at the story of the future, it's basically a damage limitation exercise at best. It's all going to be terrible. Get your head down. But there's a number of staggering trends that we don't talk about. Now, that's not to say... one thing I will say is that the future could indeed be awful. It could really, really be terrible. There are plenty of opportunities for us to blow ourselves up, kill ourselves, destroy ourselves with new technologies. Our future could end up being a bit like Kylie Minogue, sort of exciting but short. However, with every...
just on Kylie Minogue, can I share a little anecdote with you? Which I know you'll enjoy. I was actually at a party and dancing sort of 3 feet from Kylie Minogue, and David Cameron was dancing next to me.
Right.
And he whispered into my ear, "Do you realise we can see Kylie's bum?" Anyway, sorry to interrupt.
Could have been worse. Could have been worse. Yeah.
Wait, what? What, you mean they might sing something else? Or?
Anyway, moving swiftly along.
So, where was I? So I've slightly been distracted by your talk of Kylie's bum in the same sentence as David Cameron. So, yes, there's lots of things that can go wrong, and what we tend to do, certainly our presses, they tend to concentrate on a lot of the bad things. And with all these technologies, are good and bad, and a lot of what I discovered, which I hadn't heard of, was all the good stuff that was going to come with it. And all the options that we do have. So, if you, for instance, what's happening in personal genomics or the genetic revolution, the ability now for us to potentially sequence our genomes, and which will allow us to have personalised medicine. Now, that sounds like science fiction, but it's actually not that very far away. What's happening with stem cells is very exciting. There's a number of people now walking around America with bladders that have been grown from their own existing stem cells. So, taken out of it, diseased bladder, a stem cell, a whole new bladder grown, and then put back in, and then sort of basically cured of their condition. So actually replacement body parts. There's very interesting things that's happening in nanotechnology, which means a lot of things could end up getting cheaper because we're now being able to handle matter at a much smaller level. Now, also with nanotechnology, there comes the possibility of nano-weapons as well.
Sorry, what is nanotechnology?
Oh, nanotechnology. Well, this is slightly problematic.
I could tell Tim wanted to know the answer to that, so I thought...
Nano refers to anything on the scale of, I think, a millionth or a billionth of a metre. It's very small, basically. But it's not really about scale. It's about manufacture, which is why the Industrial Revolution wasn't called the yard-long technology revolution. It was called the Industrial Revolution. It's about making stuff. So what happens is that all the things that collided in the Industrial Revolution, sort of new ways of thinking and design and manufacture, they're now also colliding, but on a much smaller scale, which allows us to do incredible things with technology. I mean, one thing that's very hopeful there is we're now seeing new water filters that will probably avert the water crisis, because desalination has always been very expensive, but with new nanomembranes we'll be able to see things being much, much cheaper. So that's averting, one, for instance, talking about your the political thing that might be worrying David Cameron. Actually, if you're investing in these kind of filters, he may not have to worry about that. That may be one thing that comes off his agenda.
Your first chapter is all about, is it cryogenics?
It's not all about cryogenics, no. It's about people who want to live forever. It's about transhumanism.
And they all seem to live in America.
No, actually, I went to Oxford University to see my first transhumanist. And these are people who believe that our technology is now becoming so powerful that pretty soon we'll be able to control our biology in pretty much the way we control a computer. We'll be able to reprogram ourselves, save ourselves from death. And that raises some massive ethical questions. And the reason I went to see them first was because I really did want to throw myself in the deep end. I kind of wanted to go and see some people that on the face of it looked
nuts.
Yes, essentially crazy. And what's interesting is there's now quite a credible argument for defeating death. It's still arguable, but the people who are talking about it are not so whack anymore. So, imagine Margaret Thatcher, still here, saved by nanotechnology.
Well, she is still here.
Well, obviously she's still here. I meant politically.
Oh, you mean she could come back?
Yeah, she could be rejuvenated.
She
could be rejuvenated to her former... And, for some people that's extremely attractive, and for others it's a nightmare not worth contemplating.
Yeah, can I just pick you up on that? Because, one of the problems, isn't it, with these new technologies that, have a massive upside, they've always scared people, particularly when you can't see them. So nanotechnology is a good example. It's almost too small for people, and it's all the more scary because of that.
Yeah, the thing about the future, of course, is you can't see it. And all new technologies, because we haven't seen them before, are essentially invisible to us. And everything that is in the future and invisible and is potentially very powerful, we're very scared of. One example you might remember is IVF. When that was first being discussed, it was considered, it was a massive controversy. People thought this is man playing God, we don't want it, we shouldn't be fiddling with our bodies on this level. And it was I think, if you looked at the public opinion, it was pretty much against it, until it started working, and until you started having people having cute babies. And then you saw this very interesting flip around, where it became unethical not to offer it, because people wanted that technology working for them. So you do see this shift that when you're on the cusp of a new technology, people are very scared about what might happen. And as our technologies get more and more powerful, then the more and more scared we become.
Well, talking of technology which gets more and more powerful, you met a robot that can think.
Well,
now that to me is a deeply worrying thing.
I don't say that exactly. I met a robot that makes you think it can think.
Okay.
Which is a very important distinction. I met a robot that acts in a social way, but very quickly I forgot it was a robot, in that it reacted to me using the same cues, tilted the head, the way, shrugged when I asked it a question that it didn't understand, that kind of thing. And that's potentially a very good thing, because I don't know about you, but I find a lot of technology very difficult to use. I find it unfriendly. So this whole area of social computing and social robotics is one area where we can start to see our relationship with technology become a bit more like friendship, rather than the sort of battle that we often have at the moment. But certainly with robotics, there's been this, I don't know if you remember, but we've been waiting for the robots to arrive for about, 60 years. Back in the 1950s, the Jetsons were going to, we all believed very soon they'd be cleaning our floors and doing all that. And they haven't. They haven't got these intelligent machines. And the reason is, and Stephen Pinker says this, the reason is that the hard things are difficult when it comes to artificial intelligence, and the difficult things, the hard things are easy and the easy things are hard, which means it's actually relatively easy to get a computer to beat Garry Kasparov at chess. But it's very hard to get them to pick up a cup of tea or do the washing up. The things that a 4-year-old finds very easy, recognising a face, walking across a room, avoiding an obstacle, a computer finds incredibly difficult to do. So now roboticists are looking into child psychology and child development. There's some interesting links now between robotics and those areas of science, which is interesting.
We'll talk a little bit more about being optimistic about the future, and also the Conservative Party from Thatcher to Cameron with Tim Bale and Mark Stevenson in just a moment. But the time now is 9:15. Time for
7.3.
You're listening to the LBC Book Club here on LBC 97.3, and I'm talking to the authors of two fantastic books. Mark Stevenson, who's written An Optimist Tour of the Future. One curious man sets out to answer what's next. And he amazingly does it in 320 pages, which I think is quite an achievement. And I should say it's in paperback. It's published by Profile Books at $12.99. Tim Bale has written The Conservative Party from Thatcher to Cameron, which is a massive 400-odd pages. I've actually got the hardback version here, which is £25, but it has just come out in paperback at $14.99.
$14.99,
from
right.
Polity Press. And I know a lot of you are thinking, oh my God, 400 pages about the Conservative Party over the last 20 years. It's actually quite a gripping read, because it's a really dramatic story. We were talking just while the travel was going on about narrative, and both of these books, I think, have a fantastic narrative, but we'll come on to Tim's book a little bit later. But there's a bit of politics, in fact there's quite a lot of politics in your book, Mark, particularly when you talk about an underwater cabinet meeting. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time talking to scientists and philosophers and anybody I thought might give me a handle on what was coming next. But I really wanted to talk to somebody who would have a really practical view on what it takes to do change and real politic, as it were. And I went to see Mohammed Nasheed, who is the president of the Maldives. But a year before I met him, he was a political prisoner. I mean, the stories of his incarceration are shocking. They put laxative in his food, glass in his food. He was, I think, arrested 16 times, solitary confinement for 2 years.
You don't sort of think about the Maldives like that, do you? Think of it as very sunny and about to sink.
It was a brutal dictatorship. And anyway, he came to the UK, and you'll know this, obviously. He was in exile here and got the Maldivian democratic movement going with the help of the Conservative Party. They were very supportive of him. And so when he got into power, the thing he realised he was most concerned about was climate change, because the Maldives are a very low-lying set of islands, and of course they're sensitive to sea level rise. And he's in the process of turning this whole country carbon neutral. It basically is an example to the rest of the world, which is great, fascinating, because they're a very poor country. So if they can do it, and they are doing it, that really does sort of shame everybody else into getting on with it. But as part of his publicity campaign, he held an underwater cabinet meeting, which it went all over the world.
I remember seeing some of the pictures.
And I was one of only 4 people that wasn't in the government allowed in the water, which is a fairly crazy place to be. And I remember swimming back to the shore with the president. And I was next to him. Yeah, exactly. I was next to him, and I must have looked surprised or startled, because he gave me the underwater hand signal for "Are you okay?" And I responded with the underwater hand signal for "Yes, I am okay," because there is no underwater hand signal for "Oh my God, I'm at an underwater cabinet meeting at the Maldives. How crazy is that?" But he was an incredible man, and we're talking about narrative and optimism, and I said to him, how do you get away from those times when you're, basically being tortured? I mean, he's tortured to the brink of death twice, And he said, always by imagining a better future, that it does exist, it is real, and if you can keep that light there, then you can always get away from bad times, and you can tell that story. And he said, thoughts become real. If you have the right idea of the future, then you can make it happen. Now, I do firmly believe that. I think that's one of the things I'm trying to say in my book, is not that everything is going to be all right, because if we don't pay attention, it could be a disaster. But if we don't tell ourselves that it could be, then it certainly never will be. We've got no chance of making it better if we don't tell ourselves that's possible. And at the moment, I don't think we're doing that. So that was one of the things that came out of the book, by the time I'd finished.
There is a running theme through the book about how we can use technology to make our future better. What were the most interesting discoveries, inventions that you discovered in your trip around the world?
One of the most interesting things was not really about modern technology. So it's also about thinking and ideas. I went to the Australian outback to see some farmers, and their farms looked like Sussex in the middle of the outback. I mean, you're used to seeing pictures of the outback that look, this dry terracotta dust bowl. And they were using a farming method that mimics the way that cattle move on natural grasslands. And what that was doing for them was massively reducing their costs of production, increasing the fertility of the soil, sequestering millions of tons of CO2 into that soil, which further increased the yield because carbon's very good for the soil. And they were reducing their costs sometimes by up to 4-fold. And the technology being used there was just fences, putting the fences in a slightly different way and making the cattle move in a slightly different way. So that, to me, was, I suppose, really interesting, because it was, I went to see a lot of cutting-edge technology, the stuff we talked about earlier that makes us scary, and these people were just thinking about it differently and going, I think if we just move those fences a bit, we could do something pretty amazing here. So I found that reminded me that it's not always about technology, it's also about how you think. And one of the things I'm very keen on is promoting, I suppose, what you call critical thinking skills, the ability to think through a problem, to be able to decide what's opinion and what's really information. I mean, it's called the information age for a reason. And I do worry that if you're not able to make those judgments between, what you're being fed for a political reason rather than what you're being fed for a factual reason, then, you could be in trouble. And I think certain nations will be in trouble if they don't embrace that ability to teach their citizens how to handle the vast amount of information we're getting now, that we're having to filter ourselves because it's now published so widely and so easily available. We used to be that publishers would, filter it for us on newspapers. Now we're getting it full in the face. So we've got to learn those filtering skills ourselves. I
think that's a really interesting point, because we are bombarded with information, and we're bombarded with choice nowadays, aren't we? And that's only going to increase if we think, well, there are 1,000 TV channels
Except when it
to
comes to
watch
political
now.
parties, of course. We're not bombarded with choice there, are we?
Well, we might be in the future. We might come onto that in a second. But are we becoming? Do you think in this future that you describe, we are going to be even more individualistic than we are at the moment? And is that a problem?
I don't think we are. One of the things that you find if you look at the march of history is actually we become more able to express ourselves as individuals, but we become more collectively responsible. And one of the interesting things you'll see, particularly with the internet, is you'll find people grouping together in ways they couldn't group before. Now, there are bad things to that. You'll find echo chambers of hate on the internet. And one of the guys
tell me about it.
And one of the people I talked to, a man called John Seeley Brown, was saying, you're going to see homegrown terrorism in America because of this, because people are finding the echo chamber they want to tune into. They don't have to listen to anybody else. They've found their group of wackos they want to talk to, and you get things like what happened recently with the shooting. You've got this ability to legitimise yourself, but also on balance, what's happening is people are actually getting together to work together for their church, or to create Wikipedia, or to form a dance troupe, or to find friends. The biggest sites on the internet are encyclopedias and social networking sites, and most of those are actually good things. You'll see protest movements now getting a huge political clout now because of the ability to mobilise on the internet. So if you look at the march of history, yes, things get worse in some ways, but on balance, I think, if you take it in a broad scope and across the world, things are generally getting better. And one of those things is that interconnectedness, which I think is a good thing.
So having been on your travels, written your book, what in the future are you most looking forward to, as an optimist yourself?
Well, as I say, I'm not strictly an optimist.
Well, I hope you are after having written a book.
I came away being. I'm not. What I'm saying is, I'm not one of those people who's like, oh, well, it'll all be all right. I'm always glass half empty. As I say, I'm very keen about critical thinking and making decisions based on evidence. What am I looking forward to? That's a very good question. I think one of the things that really heartens me is what's happening in medicine. The ability to save ourselves from some of the things, some of the diseases that are really sort of debilitating, or you lose your dignity through. The ability to save children because all of a sudden, by sequencing their genome at a very early age, almost as they're born, we can say, "Oh my goodness, this child, is going to have a severe reaction to bananas." And we've now worked that out. So keep this kid away from bananas, and they won't have a horrible life. We would never have known that previously. So that I find very heartening. If anybody's had anybody who's died from a debilitating or horrible disease that you could have cured, I think that's great. The downside of that is, of course, we start to get to this point where how long do we live for? Do we live forever? How long? What happens to the pension system? What happens to when we retire? If we're all starting to live into 100 or 200, some of the people I talk to, again, they think we can live forever. So one of the reasons I wanted to write the book was to say, look, I'm not saying any of this is good or bad. I think on balance we can steer it in a good direction. But you should know about this stuff, because the debate we're having at the moment is not particularly informed. And if we don't have a debate about it properly in society, somebody else is going to start making those decisions for us. And I kind of figure that we'll probably make better decisions if we do it collectively.
Well, we've been talking about Mark Stevenson's book, An Optimist Tour of the Future. One curious man sets out to answer what's next. It's well worth a read. Profile books, $12.99 in paperback. We're about to discuss the Conservative Party from Thatcher to Cameron with my other guest, Tim Bale. If you have a question for either of my guests, 0845 6060 973 is the number to call. You can text 84850, email ian@lbc.co.uk, or you can tweet me at LBC.
84850, Ian Dale.
And I am, of course, here with you until 10 o'clock, and then it's Clive Ball who's joined me in the studio to tell you what's on his programme tonight. Hi, Clive.
Hi, Ian. Yes, I'll be here at 10. We're going to talk about the state of schools in London, with David Cameron saying that it's depressing that so many parents in London pay for their children's schooling. Well, is he right about that? And why are so many more parents in London compared to other parts of the country deciding that they want to spend their money in that way? Are London schools that bad? We want to hear from you on that. We're also going to talk about the kind of punishments we dish out for animal cruelty after this case of the man jailed for kicking a puppy. Who got banned from keeping animals for 5 years. This came in just halfway through James Wells' programme. I know he got very upset about it
did,
as an animal.
Quite right too.
Yeah, absolutely. And it raises all sorts of questions which James didn't really have a chance to get into, so we're going to look at that. And we're also going to look at rats, because they do seem to be becoming bolder and brazen. And one of them, there's a lot of...
I thought Tim Bale was going to be sick.
I know.
Just clear my throat.
There are lots of obvious jokes, but apparently one rat has actually been caught on camera going across the door of number 10 during a news report.
I saw that last night.
And they zoomed in the papers, and it actually is. I mean, it's a gift for the headline writers, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
But the fact that rats are sort of openly wandering the streets now, and, avoiding all the obvious jokes. Well, I think we'll investigate rats.
I grew up on a farm, and I know everything there is to know about rats. I could tell you a lot of stories on that subject, but we've only got 25 minutes left of the programme.
Yes, maybe after midnight for that.
Maybe.
Yeah. OK, thank you very much.
Cheers, Clive. We'll see you at 10 o'clock. Right, let's get back to the LBC Book Club with Tim Bale and Mark Stevenson. Mark Stevenson's book, An Optimist Tour of the Future, and Tim Bale's book is the Conservative Party from Thatcher to Cameron. I suppose that the narrative of the 20 years that you're covering in this book, Tim, is the Conservative Party trying to get over Margaret Thatcher, and the cover is interesting here because you've got a sort of a picture of Margaret Thatcher from the back. She looks as if she's attending a funeral on that picture, and then David Cameron sort of emerging out of her back in a sort of reverse Alien shot, I suppose. But I mean, part of the reason the Conservatives did not do very well between 1990 and 2005 was because they just hadn't come to terms with the fall of Margaret Thatcher and the way that it happened. I would say that anyway. Is that what you talk about in your book a lot?
I mean, I think there is a case for saying that, but I think it's more to do with the fact that they, I think, got stuck with the idea that she had a kind of permanent recipe for electoral success, and what they didn't realise was that she was absolutely great for, you know, the late 70s and most of the 80s, you know, and what she was suggesting then worked and probably needed to be done. But, you know, by the time she fell, actually the voters were looking for something else. The country probably needed something else. And it was a mistake then to go into the 97 election, the 2001 election, 2005 election with that Thatcherite recipe. People were no longer looking for that. They were looking for something else. And I think the Conservatives got a little bit hung up, if you like, ideologically.
But I think it was the manner of her departure which has caused the Conservative Party to have a sort of 20-year nervous twitch, really, because a lot of people felt very guilty about it.
Yeah, I mean, I buy into that a little bit, but I mean, I think that's all a bit too Freudian, to be honest. I think really, although that poisoned relationships within the party, I mean, I think as a party, and, you know, when you're trying to explain its failure to connect with the British people, it's not simply, you know, it's kind of guilt complex about how it did or didn't get rid of a particular leader. It's the fact that that leader, for so many people in the Conservative Party, became absolutely iconic in a way that no other leader really in the Conservative Party had ever been. And it almost became a kind of cardinal sin to suggest any departure from the kind of things that she'd been doing back in the 1980s. And I mean, there's one episode that's recalled in the book where Peter Lilly, who'd been known as a kind of arch Thatcherite, gave a speech under William Hague's leadership, where he seemed to be suggesting that the party needed to rethink some of its attitudes, and he was torn apart.
Yeah.
Torn apart in the media. I mean, it was bad timing on his part, because it was actually across town there was a party going on to celebrate her birthday, I think, so it wasn't the best timing on his part to make that announcement. But I mean, that showed, I think, really how little room there was in the party at that time for anybody to suggest anything new. And you can't, I mean, this comes back to something I'm sure Mark realises when he looks at some of the organisations and people that he looks at. You can't get yourself into a situation as any kind of organisation or institution where it becomes betrayal to suggest any kind of movement away. You know, once you're in that situation, you really are stuck, and stuck very badly.
Yeah, there's a great quote from Einstein, which is, you cannot solve the problems you've got today with the level of thinking you were at when you created them. Yeah. And it sounds to me that what you're saying is the Conservative Party was trying to solve the problems of today with the thinking of yesterday.
Well, I think that I think is absolutely true, where it was a very backward-looking party rather than a forward-looking party. And I think until David Cameron came along, a lot of people seem to think that you could solve the problems of 2005 with the methods of the 1980s. And I thought Cameron actually got it spot on when I think it was in the leadership campaign, when he said, well, yeah, we've got to take the principles of Thatcherism and apply them to modern-day situations. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're the same solutions.
No, absolutely right. I mean, you couldn't, as you say, you can believe in Thatcherite first principles without actually trying to apply the kind of policies that she applied back in the 1980s. I think you're absolutely right. I do think, however, that Cameron, you know, did slightly depart further than that. I mean, I think he did to some extent drag the party back towards the centre and slightly away from that Thatcherite legacy, whether it be based on principles or on policy. So, I mean, I don't, on the other hand, think, though, that he totally rejected Thatcherism or, you know, wanted to sort of put it in the trash can of history or anything like that. I mean, I think David Cameron's genius, or part of David Cameron's genius, was to say, you know, that was then, but this is now. You know,
yeah.
Great at the time. I thought she was marvellous for this country, but, you know, hey, we have to move on. We have to make our own policies, our own ideas.
Can I ask you a kind of a wider question about politics, because I've got you both here, which is one of the things that I talk about in my book is innovation a lot. And when we talk about innovation, we talk about what's happening in technology or medicine, whatever, and we're very comfortable about that. And politicians will often talk about, you know, we need to stimulate innovation, we need to have more engineers or scientists, or even innovation in the arts and fashion. But one of the things we see very little of, I think, is what I call institutional innovation, where institutions change the way they work in order to facilitate that change. And to me, it seems to me that the classic example of that is actually the way our democracy runs. When parliamentary democracy arrived, it was a massive innovation. I think the last innovation it had was giving women the vote. I mean, we live in an internet society, and yet, once every 4 years I get to choose from two people, both of which I don't entirely agree with. So I'm wondering, what can these parties do, what can the Conservative Party, the Labour Party do to bring our democracy into the 21st century?
In a sense, that's where William Hague failed, where Ian Duncan Smith failed, where Michael Howard failed. And I think Cameron did succeed because he innovated within the Conservative Party, changed the way it worked a lot. He introduced completely new systems, some very, very radical new policies, which he said were conservative, but many people within the party didn't feel that they were. So I think you're right that if you're going to be successful as a political party, you've got to innovate, and I think that's what Ed Miliband is facing now in the Labour Party. How does he innovate in a party that actually, in itself, is probably more conservative with a small c than the Conservative Party?
Yeah, I mean, one of the great things that the Conservative Party has going for it is the fact that it is, I think, less prone to inertia than the Labour Party. It doesn't have the same kind of rules and regulations and that kind of process-orientated ethos.
And the members have little control.
No, exactly. So if you pick the right leader in the Conservative Party, he can move this thing around pretty quickly. I mean, most parties are kind of oil tankers, but you can steer the Conservative Party around faster than you can steer the Labour Party around. And I think, that's what David Cameron has shown. But the downside of that, of course, is if you pick the wrong guy, you really are in trouble, because it's the leader, really, who directs everything. And
well, just on that subject, let's take a phone call. Paul is in Stoke-on-Trent and has a question related to that. Good evening, Paul. Hi.
Good evening, Ian, and hello, Tim as well. Yeah, I just want to ask you a question. Do you think David Cameron will go down in history as the best Conservative leader? Do you think?
Or ever?
Ever, yeah, you could say that. Yeah. It was like a revolutionist or, radical, whatever.
Well, I think he's going to take some shifting Margaret Thatcher.
Or Tony Blair, I think, should he?
Absolutely. In most people's eyes. But, I mean, I do think he has the potential to be, a great Prime Minister. I mean, I do think that people who criticise the fact that he didn't win an overall majority in 2010 are barking up the wrong tree. I mean, he did amazingly well, given where the Conservative Party got itself to in 2005, to come back even to be the largest party. So I think as an opposition leader, he was pretty good. And I think he's got the makings of a really good Prime Minister, actually. I mean, he's the kind of person who seems to be able to delegate to some extent, although there are criticisms of him running a clique, as there always are of any leader. He's certainly, I think, a fantastic orator. I mean, certainly he's got Prime Minister's questions down pat, and that's quite important in the way that we regard our leaders, rightly or wrongly. And he seems to be actually quite good at making decisions. I mean, he doesn't seem to be one of these people who's sort of, paralysed by analysing everything. He seems
to be
like
his predecessor.
Well, I wasn't going to say that, but yes, or indeed President Clinton's been accused of that, and indeed so's Barack Obama, of seeing too many angles and not actually being able to go for it. Whereas Cameron clearly, given the pace of reform that we've seen since the government came in, is able to make fairly, quick decisions and then move on things. So, I mean, the omens are pretty good, I think.
Well, Paul, thank you for your question. I do think that you're right in... I think it's far too early to say, well, he could be the best Conservative leader ever. He's got to go some to beat Churchill or Thatcher, I guess. But he does seem to fit the job like a hand in a glove. I mean, he looks really comfortable in the job, doesn't he? Which Gordon Brown never, ever did. Tony Blair did.
No, absolutely. And I think, for example, the speech he gave in the Commons on the Bloody Sunday report, I mean, that was just pitch perfect. That, for me, was a real sort of, Blair's Princess Diana moment, really, in a way. I mean, it was just so beautifully done and crafted and so simple, and expressed, what, the British needed to say to the Irish in some ways, and what the Irish wanted to hear. So, I mean, I think he's got the qualities of a statesman as well as the qualities of a politician.
Mark, I don't know how political you are. I mean, from your book, I think you probably do have your own political opinions. What do you make of David Cameron?
Well, I'm actually, I would call myself almost post-political now, and it comes back to the question I was asking earlier, in that I was asking about innovation of the political system, not necessarily the Conservative Party, and I think like a lot of people, quite disenfranchised because the pace of change is so fast and the pace of innovation in our political system is so slow. So I'm much more interested in more of an engineering way of looking at things. Who's got a solution here and can they implement it, and who's stopping them? And sometimes it's people from the left and sometimes it's people from the right. So I would actually say, and it sounds kind of hokey to say, I'm kind of post-political. I really do. I'm interested in issues now. If there's something that can be done and can be done by a coalition of people, to use a popular phrase.
Well, I think
get on
that
with
you
it.
speak for a lot of people. I think tribal politics in this country is on the way out, and that people are willing to vote different ways now, which they just weren't in the past. You're listening to the LBC Book Club with me, Ian Dale, and with Tim Bale and Mark Stevenson, talking about their books on the Conservative Party and optimism. It's 9:45. Time for
7.3.
I'm talking to Tim Bale, the author of The Conservative Party from Thatcher to Cameron, and also Mark Stevenson, who's written An Optimist Tour of the Future. Now, there weren't many optimists in the Tory party in the mid-1990s because Europe was an issue that split the Conservative Party like nothing since, I suppose, the Corn Laws. Maybe that's a slight exaggeration. But it's an issue that didn't go away, really, I would say, until David Cameron became leader. And I suppose one of his successes is almost eliminating Europe as a split issue in the Conservative Party. It rears its head again from time to time. We all remember the pulling out of the group in the European Parliament and all that. But generally, it's not as a divisive issue as it had been up until 2005.
Yeah, I think, to be honest, it was easier for David Cameron than it had been for some of his predecessors, because what you've seen gradually over the years is the Conservative Party generally moving towards a much more Eurosceptic position. So, there are just fewer Europhiles within the Conservative Party, so there's less room for an argument. And I also think, to be honest, that Europe shouldn't really pose an opposition to many problems once it gets its act together. The problems come in government when, of course, you can't necessarily fulfil all your promises. And we've already seen, of course, the Conservatives in coming together with the Liberal Democrats have had to dump some of the ideas they had about repatriating policies, which, a lot of people on the Conservative side would very much like to have seen. Now, the question, of course, is whether David Cameron would have liked to have dumped those policies anyway, and is using the coalition with the Lib Dems as a front for getting out of something, I think, that would have always been very, very awkward. And the problem for David Cameron is, because the Conservative Party's got so much more Eurosceptic, then you've also seen a growth of people who believe, not just that we need to step back a little from the EU, but we actually need to get out of the European Union altogether, and that's a fairly common view among Conservative activists, and some MPs share that view as well.
Now, the leadership of the Conservative Party, by which I mean David Cameron and all the people around him, I think have become a lot more liberal with a small L. But do you think the grassroots of the Conservative Party are still the same kind of people as they were 10, 15, 20 years ago, the kind of people that constantly want to bang on about Europe and immigration?
Well, we've actually got some very interesting research on Conservative Party members that's been done actually by a colleague of mine at Sussex University, and probably about 25% of all grassroots Conservatives are what you'd call liberal Conservatives, but then that leaves the rest who are not, and some of them are very Thatcherite, so in other words they're quite sort of authoritarian and libertarian on the economy, and then some are slightly more kind of centrist on the economy but still hold very traditional views about social issues. So I think you're absolutely right to say that David Cameron, to some extent, is kind of outnumbered, if you like, in his party. And I think that probably shows in Parliament as well. And it's interesting that the tensions in Parliament at the moment are over things like, the prisons issue, for example, where Ken Clarke's getting a lot of flack. So, there definitely is not a liberal small L majority in the Conservative Party at the moment. One
thing I found interesting is I used to do quite a lot of speaking to Conservative associations all around the country. And back in sort of 2000, 2002, 2003, when you'd done your speech, you have questions, and you would guarantee that one of the first three questions would be about Europe. And then when I was doing it before the last election, very, very rarely did you ever get that. So, I mean, I do think, obviously, the whole party hasn't changed overnight, but I think that issue has almost been dealt with. What do you think David Cameron can learn from the experience of previous party leaders? But I mean Haig, Duncan Smith, Howard, John Major, maybe.
I mean, I think as a Prime Minister, the real challenge, it's a challenge even if you're opposition leader, but for a Prime Minister's particular challenge is not getting insulated, not developing that kind of bunker mentality. Thatcher developed it towards the end. John Major, perforce really, because he was so badly criticised by so many in his party, developed it. And of course, some of the people that David Cameron took over from, the ones you've mentioned, had this kind of bunker mentality as well. But it's really, really difficult as a Prime Minister because you've got to spend so much time making decisions. You're doing all sorts of things that, you absolutely have to do, but yet you still have to make time to keep your troops, particularly in the parliamentary party, happy. So it's somehow finding a way to do that, and it isn't good enough simply to have a very good PPS, for example, that keeps an eye on the party. You actually have to be in there. You have to work the tea rooms. You have to, appear friendly, and that's one challenge that Cameron's got, because already there's criticism, and there has been since the start, that he surrounds himself, with people of like mind from a like social background, and people can't get at him, and that's something he's going to have to watch.
I was talking to Mohammed Nasheed. He said something interesting about Mohammed Nasheed, the
Who's
president of Maldives.
Oh, right, yeah.
And he said that he was so busy now with the day-to-day of government that he was beginning to lose the big picture. It's a very candid interview, and he said, in some ways, actually missed my time in solitary confinement because I had time to think then and talk. And he meant it in all seriousness. And he said, I think that's probably why it is 4 or 5 years as a leader. I think that's maybe all you should be, because by the time you've got to the end of 4 or 5 years, you've so lost the big picture.
And I think that's one thing David Cameron really understands. I remember interviewing him about 2 years ago, and discussing that issue with him, and I really got the impression that he had learnt from Margaret Thatcher, had learnt from Tony Blair. Go before your time is up, and you will then be seen as a much better Prime Minister than you would have been.
Yeah, I mean
otherwise.
that's very, very interesting, because if you look back at Prime Ministers, they very often start with that idea, but by the time they come towards the point where they should retire, they get this sort of idea of infallibility and indispensability, and they find it very, very difficult to go on. I mean, Churchill is the absolute acme of that. I mean, the guy had 2 or 3 strokes, was virtually incapable, and yet carried on till he was 80 years old.
I mean, Howard Wilson was the interesting one there, of course, who did go. I mean, he realised that his faculties were failing, and he went at a time that was of a surprise to everybody. I don't think Cameron is going to be one of these long-term Prime Ministers. I think if he gets the 5 years in this Parliament, I think he would go midway through the next one. But do you think, Tim, that he is the heir to Blair or the heir to Thatcher?
Well, I think he probably...
Or Macmillan.
Well, I think he combines, the skill sets of both of them. I mean, and obviously, if you look at the policies that the Conservative government, the coalition government is following right now, I mean,
or as Ed Miliband says, the Conservative-led government.
Yeah, so the Conservative-led government. I mean, I think you are seeing, a party that still very much believes that you have to shrink the state in order to energise the economy and indeed to energise society. So there is a touch of Thatcher there. He's clearly got the kind of communicative skills of Tony Blair, but he'd also, I think, like to argue he's got those kind of one nation instincts that Harold Macmillan has, and in doing what he's doing with the economy and the welfare state, he's hopefully, he says anyway, trying to make sure that the people at the bottom don't suffer.
What do you think a post-Cameron Conservative Party would look like? Let's imagine that he goes, say he wins the next election, stays on for a couple of years. Somebody asked me the other day who I thought would succeed Cameron, and I thought, I haven't got a clue. And that's something that I feel I, as a sort of political pundit type, ought to know, but I don't.
No, I mean, I think that's a very good point. I mean, I think he's become so dominant, really, that it is difficult to see. I mean, I remember, just before the election, people saying, what if he loses the election? What will happen? And I just could not, like you, foresee anybody around at the moment. But I guess what we do know from political history is very often people are succeeded by the most unlikely candidate, and someone we don't foresee, coming along.
My vote goes to Eric Pickles.
Oh, you put it there, yeah.
But Mark Stevenson, you will now think that we've got subsumed in the Westminster Village gossip of personality over post-political issues, won't you?
Yes.
I mean, politics is fascinating, and it's all about stories, and we tell interesting stories about them. And there's characters in there that do things, that we like or we hate, and we make villains of them, we make heroes of them, often not really based on what they're actually doing, but on what the papers tell us we should be thinking, or what, our prejudices tell us.
Yeah, I mean, but I think the interesting thing about politics is clearly, you have these very big issues, you have principles, etc., but they can only be put into action by individuals themselves, and that's why in some ways you can't really talk about politics without talking about them.
Well, unfortunately, that brings us to the end of our discussion. We could have gone on for another hour, couldn't we? But if either of those, either our authors have captured your imagination, their books are called Tim Bale's book, The Conservative Party from Thatcher to Cameron, Polity Press, $14.99 paperback, An Optimist Tour of the Future by Mark Stevenson, Profile Books, $12.99. Thank you both very much for joining us. Clive Ball is up next. This is LBC.